All right, welcome to the City of Yachats work session of City Council and Planning Commission of the July 16th, 2025. Why don't we just go around the room for introductions as to who's in attendance? We'll start over here.
Yep, Terry.
Barry Collins.
Nicole Headland.
Craig Birdie.
Mary Ellen O'Shaughnessy.
Bobby Price.
Neil Marcus. Lauren Dickinson, Planning Commission. Mark Sackmo.
Okay, thank you. So we have two planning commissioners and this full council.
We're online as well.
And two planning commissioners online. Wonderful. All right, and they should be recorded, and we should have that as attendees. All right, so I'm going to just hand it over to the city manager or the planning commission. Who wants to take the lead on this?
I'm happy to introduce the topic today. So we have a joint planning commission and city council work group happening today to hear from Cascade Partners, who has been working with the city and the planning commission. We've got a project group and an advisory group that have also been meeting with the Cascadia Partners. This work that we're doing with them is being completed as a third phase project with them and is funded through a DLCD grant. And it's been a really enlightening to see this project kind of start from the beginning and come to this point where we're looking at putting real codes into place. And I look forward to having you all hear what the work Cascadia Partners has put into this. I do know that we did receive a comment from the public. So Mayor, I'm not sure where you on the agenda you'd like to hear this message from a public community member on input. I know you each have a copy of this. It was received last night. If we want to hear after or before the presentation, or
I suggest after.
Okay, sounds good. Rachel, would you like to take it away for Cascadia Partners?
Sure. Thank you, Bobby, and good afternoon, Mayor, Council, Planning Commission. I'm Rachel Cotton. I'm a senior associate with Cascadia Partners. I'm joined today by my colleagues Victor Tran and Ray Haggerty. And as Bobby mentioned, we'll be walking through the code update project. Victor, are you able to share the slides? So the slide presentation that I believe you've received in advance to review, we'll be talking through, who are we? What is this project? We've done a code audit, and so we will be summarizing that work and the findings of that work, and also what we mean when we say code audit. And we'll also be talking through some code concepts with you. These are some preliminary ideas for changes to the zoning and development ordinance. And finally, we'll leave ample time for questions and discussion. The intent of this meeting, apart from being informational, is to really answer any questions that are coming up related to the work and the next steps, and also talk through some feedback about these preliminary code concepts. And so I'll get right into it. Next slide, please, Victor. So yeah, we have, we know up to 2 hours scheduled for this meeting. We're hoping to take around 90 minutes at most, including the questions and discussion. And we'll see what we hear, but I will get started just talking through kind of that project background. Next slide, please, that Bobby mentioned. A little bit about Cascadia Partners. So we are an Oregon-based urban planning firm. We specialize in development code updates, housing related code and policy work, and real estate development feasibility analysis. And we've worked now with the Department of Land Conservation and Development on several similar projects across the state. So we're really happy to be continuing to work in Yachats on this housing related work because we understand the value and the need within the community. So a little bit about the past work. We've been partnered with the community since 2022, doing a series of housing related projects. So we started with what's called a housing needs analysis. This may be review for some of you who have been included as part of this work in the past, but we just wanted to provide a comprehensive summary of what's been done so far and how the pieces connect. So as part of the housing needs analysis, this is a technical exercise that looks at the land supply within the city's urban growth boundary, as well as the 20-year projection for housing need. And it looks at different types of housing. It looks at the existing development regulations, the different zones and what's allowed. And then it projects what will be needed in the future over the next 20 years. And so a key finding from that housing needs analysis, we call it an HNA work, is that Yachats has a deficit of land, so not enough land under current regulations for housing types like townhomes, plexes, so duplex, triplex, quadplex, and multifamily housing. And overall, the finding was that there's a need for additional housing types and ways to increase the affordability of housing. So we took that preliminary technical work and then we produced what's called a housing implementation plan in 2023. And in that plan, we identified some general strategies to help meet some of those housing needs identified in the analysis. And then also we recommended some specific code changes to meet those housing needs. And finally, now we're doing a code update. So all of this preliminary work is informing now the current project, which is a code update. And the goal of the project is to produce amendments to the code to align with some state requirements related to housing, as well as local housing goals. And this work will implement some of those strategies that we identified in the housing implementation plan. So that's how all the pieces connect. Next slide. And a little bit more about the background of the current project. So this is a city-led effort to modernize the zoning and land use code to support more housing options, improve affordability, and reflect community values. The project has 3 key parts, and those include some code updates to meet legal requirements. So there are a series of housing-related statutes that the state of Oregon has implemented over the past several years. And being small in size, Yachats has, and this is very typical of many cities across Oregon, Yachats hasn't kept up with all of these new requirements. They change, every legislative session. Seemingly there are new requirements. And so part of our work will just be to meet the legal requirements aligning with those statutes. So that's kind of a mandatory part of this work.
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
I'm unclear. I know throughout the presentation, there's multiple references to legal requirements. It seems rather vague to me, especially given like House Bill 2001, as well as ORS 174.445 or whatever it is. Both specifically exclude cities of under 10,000. So when we say legal requirements, I think I'm going to need to see some more explicit references as we move forward.
Yes, that's an excellent point, and we will cover that as part of this presentation. So there are some requirements that apply to cities that are larger than Yachats, and in that case, they're not applicable. So we've done a full code audit to look at what are the requirements that apply specifically to Yachats and what are the changes that need to be made. And I'll review that as part of this presentation. So excellent point. There are many that apply to cities of all sizes, and that's what we've focused on here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and great point. There's a lot to keep track of, so it's I guess a good segue to say that the code concepts work is meant to be an exploration of some policy ideas to support housing and livability goals in Yachats. So I like to think of these as recommendations, you know, looking at all the past work, the housing needs analysis, the housing implementation plan, engagement that we've done with the community and will continue to do. These are some ideas for how to meet your housing and livability goals through optional changes to your code. And part of the work that Cascadia is doing, you know, we, as mentioned, work with communities of all sizes across the state and throughout the country. So we're attuned to some best practices for producing housing that is more affordable and more viable from a development perspective after some modifications to the development regulations. So that will be part of our work. And an important point of clarification, we're not only kind of generating ideas for you, but we'll also be writing the actual amendments to the code. So once we go through the process, the compliance piece, as mentioned, is mandatory. We've identified a series of changes that will need to be made to come into legal compliance. The code concepts will work and continue to work with the community to come up with kind of best path forward for those ideas. And then we'll turn them into amendments to the development code to implement both the legal requirements as well as the preferred code concepts. Next slide. So just a little deeper dive into the data from the housing needs analysis. I think this is sort of hopefully doesn't seem redundant, but just to really kind of emphasize why some of these strategies are being recommended. When we looked at the supply of land within the urban growth boundary, and then we looked at the mix of housing that will be needed over the next 20 years. The blue bars here measure capacity, so how much land is there and what are the development regulations that are allowed on that land. And then the green bars represent what is the projected need. And so what we found when we did that analysis is while there is enough land available for detached single unit or single family housing and manufactured homes, there's not enough land available right now under the current development regulations for townhomes and plexes and multifamily housing. And some of this is based on historical permitting data. So in some cases, the regulations allow these types of housing, but they're not being built. And that's another thing that we're looking to troubleshoot as part of this work. Next slide. And so to begin, we did a code audit. And as part of today's presentation, we are going to summarize the results of the code audit. The code audit included that legal compliance piece. So what are the state rules and statutes that apply specifically to Yachats and relate to housing? And how is the code either meeting or not meeting those requirements? Then we did an audit for clear and objective standards. So under the state requirements, there is a need for a clear and objective pathway for housing development for the purpose of not causing unnecessary cost or delay. When we say clear and objective, I like to think of that as meaning two people can look at the same regulations and come to the same conclusion about what they mean. So things that are measurable, you know, very clearly saying, here is the minimum lot size, and here is the types of housing allowed to be built, those things are considered to be clear and objective. The other type of regulations that sometimes appear in code are what are called discretionary. So things like must be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood without a clear sense of what that means. Must be in harmony with the environment. Things like that are very discretionary. There's no clear sense of how you would interpret or implement that type of regulation. And whereas those can be guidelines for certain types of housing, there also always needs to be a clear and objective pathway for that type of housing to be approved. If someone wants to do something slightly different and go through an alternative pathway, that's okay, but they need to have that clear and objective pathway. And in some cases, that doesn't exist in the code. So that's something we've flagged. And then finally, there are some best practices for creating housing options and housing that is more affordable. And we did an audit of the code to flag areas that we would recommend making changes to allow additional housing options. Next slide. So to address the point about, there are all these different bills passing and requirements, we have a summary of all of the statutes and what the requirements are and whether or not those apply to Yachats. So in this case, this summary you're seeing, we've already done, taken a look at, does this apply? And that's the only things that you'll see included here. So the gentleman used an example of middle housing requirements. That's what House Bill 2001 was. Those don't apply to Yachats because Yachats is too small. That's just a clarification, but all of these things do apply. So we took a look at what the requirements are. In this case, there are some applying to residential homes and facilities, approving needed housing, reducing density or height. For those who are kind of illegal eagle type, this is meant to be a reference. If you're very interested in the details of these things, I would encourage you to look them up. But otherwise, we've sort of moved through this, just knowing that our job is to make the interpretation and recommend any needed changes. So these are areas where the code was found to be in compliance with the requirement. Next slide. In some cases, what is in the code partially complies with the requirement. There are some allowances for manufactured home parks that will need to be changed a little bit, as well as manufactured home park subdivisions to comply with the requirements. They must be allowed on enough land essentially to meet the demand for them, and they must have that clear and objective approval pathway. And some of those things will need changes to be compliant. Next slide. Then there were some areas where the code is not compliant with what the statute requires. These relate to land use decisions, defining occupancy of housing based on familial relationship. So essentially you can't discriminate, you can't regulate housing occupancy differently based on if people are related or not is a change. Some requirements related to manufactured housing. Essentially, you can't require additional siting and design standards or things that are discretionary for manufactured housing that you don't apply to stick-built housing. Some requirements related to occupancy of recreational vehicles, and finally, some requirements related to single-room occupancy housing, which must be allowed in residential zones. For those on the Planning Commission, we know that the Cascades West Council of Governments has been working on some of these things to produce some amendments to code. So we are aware of that, and we will not replicate those efforts, but we'll kind of incorporate those into the work that we're doing. So those items are flagged in green just to let you know that we are following along with that. And finally, there are some things that are kind of allowances in statute where you don't need to have these in your code, but our recommendation is to include them to provide additional clarity. So some examples of that are if the regulations for housing change after somebody has submitted an application, they're allowed to opt into the new regulations. Again, that doesn't need to be in code, but we think it's a good practice to include that so an applicant understands they have that option. And then for affordable housing, the state specifically allows some additional placement for affordable housing and density and height bonuses outright that we find that not everybody knows about without seeing in the code. So those are ones that we also recommend including. Next slide. I guess I'll pause there to see if anyone has questions about the legal compliance audit. This is very technical. It's not really meant, this is more, we are interpreting these things. We are going to make amendments to address all of the needs. It's meant to be informational, but it's not meant to be so much something that we would like your feedback on, unless there are specific questions or concerns.
Rachel, in the last couple planning commission meetings, we've been looking at some of the procedures that are in the title for things like property line adjustments, partitioning, setbacks. Is that the sort of thing that's going to be covered in the limited land use decision updates? Because
Yes.
it doesn't appear to be consistent with the applicable ORS 197 section.
Those are, I don't know off the top of my head the exact things that we flagged, but they're included in our audit. So anything that is a requirement, I'm seeing that we flagged tentative subdivisions and partitions, replats, need to be a type 2 or a type 1 procedure. So those are things where we are attuned to what the requirement is, and we will make related recommendations to the code change.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I guess I have one. With the suggested amendments to things, we as a city, do we still have the ability to say we still want to keep like the 30-foot high requirement?
Are you talking about height?
In terms of height?
Yes, so that's something that's not included here. And we'll talk about that potentially as part of the code concepts. So height is not something we flagged apart from for affordable housing. There is a specialized bonus granted outright to housing that is deed restricted, meeting affordability for certain income levels. And it's based on the density of the housing.
Are you going to clarify that more later?
Yes, well, that will be clarified. So that is one where that is not optional. I can just provide an example for most of Yachats if the existing density is 16 units an acre or less. Housing, again, that is deed restricted affordable housing would be eligible for up to a 12-foot height bonus. I will just flag that this is a pretty obscure case. I wouldn't expect this to come up regularly. This is just something that the state provides as an opportunity to produce basically more options for development of affordable housing. But for generalized housing development, I wouldn't expect you to see any changes to those height restrictions.
Okay, thank you.
Question, this, not about this particular screen, but the report itself. Has this been, provided to the city in hard copy form?
Yes, so we are, as Bobby kind of mentioned initially, we have a project management team that includes city staff, 2 members of the planning commission, and then we have an advisory committee that includes additional members. So they have all received and reviewed this information. And we have produced a summary table that I think at the discretion of city staff could be shared out. So if that's something you're interested in seeing more detail on any of these findings, that does exist. It's been produced in hard copy and has been provided to the city.
No, my current concern is just the, being able to read the darn thing on the screen. It would have been preferable for us to have hard copies.
Oh, okay, of the slides themselves. The slides, we can share those out. Those have been provided to the city and could be shared out with this group following the meeting.
It's linked on the agenda.
I mean,
I think it's on the agenda, linked on,
where at, look, where at?
under the first part, under the work session.
What's even,
Yes, if
you
you,
scroll down, it's included.
yeah, if you click on the agenda, the first one. has links
Some
to
of it did look
concepts.
familiar. Okay, we have it. Thank you. Ignore my last report.
Okay, yes, I wasn't, I assumed the slides had been shared out, but wasn't sure. So thanks for clarifying to the staff. Okay, I'm gonna keep us moving. So as mentioned, we also did a review for clear and objective standards. And those are, you know, there must be a clear and objective pathway for housing. And there are some cases in the code where there are conditions of approval or other requirements that would not be considered clear and objective. And we've detailed some of those here, and those will also be amended in the package of code amendments. Next slide. And finally, this is sort of, so if we think of the pieces of this project, the code audit, the legal compliance piece, the clear and objective piece, those are pieces that are moving forward. They're not things that we need feedback on beyond what we've already received from the staff and the project management team and the advisory committee. But the code audit relates to those options that the city has to make changes. These are not required, but these are optional in the interest of moving closer toward your housing and livability goals and implementing some of the recommendations of that housing implementation plan that we talked about. So as part of the code audit, we look at what we think of as barriers to housing. And then we flag those and we produce what are called code concepts meant to respond to improving and eliminating or reducing the barriers or completely eliminating them. So some of the things, just to frame up where these code concepts come from, are in response to the barriers that we found when we looked at the code. And those include use regulations that are too restrictive in residential zones. So meaning what types of housing can be developed in residential zones. As some examples, right now Yachats doesn't allow accessory dwelling units. That's one we know there's an interest in. Things like cottage clusters, some types of middle housing. So plexes, cottage clusters are included, townhouses, just a little bit more option to create some of those housing types, but meet the other development standards in the various residential zones. Residential density that is too low. We know about Yachats, there's a limited supply of land, there's the ocean, there's topography, And the land that exists is very expensive. And so being able to be efficient with the use of that land is very important, and that's not always possible given things like high minimum lot sizes. So that is a related finding, minimum lot area. If you need a specific size of lot to produce a unit of housing, and that doesn't scale as you want to add additional units, you're not going to see additional units developed because it doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint. So that's another thing we flagged. And related to that is lot coverage and setbacks. So in some cases, again, to be able to use land efficiently, we're not talking about significantly updating or upping the density allowances, but just some kind of gentle changes that would allow additional units in a way that's compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. And again, thinking back to those findings of the housing needs analysis, things like townhomes, duplexes, cottages, ADUs, how can the development standards be tweaked a bit to allow those types of housing to be incorporated into the community. Also in commercial zones, right now, mixed use development isn't allowed outright. So combination of residential and commercial development is a conditional use. So it would go to the planning commission. That's a change that we have flagged. And then missing and ineffective incentives for affordable housing. So some of those, as I mentioned in the legal compliance audit, are requirements. You could put them into the code, then developers interested in affordable housing would know those things. You could potentially go above and beyond that, and that could be a choice as well. Are there any questions about this list of barriers?
Yeah, and this is a theme that I will keep harping on, that I think is too, if you're too myopic about housing and simply building housing, you miss the bigger picture. And the bigger picture would be, for example, 60% of our housing being second homes. So if we want to improve housing and encourage more people to live here, how do we, what can we do to encourage full-time residency? Building more duplexes and increasing the density is not automatically get us to what our end goal would be, which is to have full-time citizens. And as I looked through the code concepts, I didn't see any of that in here, which would be, how do we develop full-time residents? Maybe bring that 60% number down to something more typical for communities. So I need to put that out there, and I want to put it out there early so that you are aware that that is a concern that I and many others share. Simply building more units does not, in Yachats, does not ensure full-time residents.
So I've been thinking a lot about this and how if we can increase the density, do some of these things, maybe some of those second homes would put an ADU on or make their house into a duplex. So creating more housing, creating more of like a lived-in feel versus a second home feel. So I think some of these changes could encourage some of these second homes to include a full-time.
I agree that some of the changes would, but I think one of the overriding principles should be that our goal is to encourage full-time residents, not simply build lower cost second homes.
Yes, I appreciate you bringing that up because that's certainly relevant to the conversation. And one, the projections of need take into account that vacancy rate that you mentioned is going to continue forward. So this would be housing not only as second homes, but housing for full-time residents of Yachats. And what you mentioned is partially a code related issue, but also a policy issue. In addition to code changes, there are policy changes that you could potentially implement that aren't a part of this project, but that are relevant to the full picture of the issue that you're mentioning. You know, just off the top of my head, pairing additional housing with you know, incentives for full-time residents in some other way could be a way to meet some of those other goals that go beyond the code. But as somebody else mentioned, it's also a supply and demand issue, and it's a consumer preference issue. And there are housing types that I believe would be more appealing to somebody looking for a second home, and housing types that would appeal more and be more attainable for somebody living and working in Yachats. Housing types that would be more appealing for aging in place in Yachats, and that sort of thing. So we're looking at that full picture as we think about these code concepts and recommendations and issues. And I think it's important to keep it all in mind because it's all interrelated.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel, are you aware of any communities in Oregon that are resort towns like Yachats, where they've come up with positive incentives to have more full-time residents versus second homes? Because I know this issue happens all up and down the coast. And I was wondering if anybody has come up with an active solution to that, aside from what you talked about, where just the general encouragement of building will take care of some of that. But has anybody actually been able to push the needle from maybe 60% to 50% or something like that?
So the cases that I am aware of most are relate to kind of the supply and demand piece. So the idea that if you are opening up additional opportunities for different types of housing, you're going to naturally attract different demographics. And Newport is an example of, you know, Newport's of the size, so it's 10,000 population and over. Same with Lincoln City. So they've had to implement some additional things like middle housing allowances. And in doing so, that doesn't necessarily speak to what you're saying. You know, it's not a specific tool, but it's part of the equation of, okay, if you're seeing, you know, for anyone familiar with Newport, if you know the Wilder development, that is designed to be full-time residents. It's not allowed to be a short-term rental. The size of the homes and the price points is conducive to be, you know, what's thought of as workforce housing, in some cases retirement housing. But they've structured both the development standards, so the lot sizes, the density allowances, the size of the streets, as well as the regulations within that development to be responsive to that desire to attract full-time residents. So I don't know if that's specific enough, but that's an example I can think of. I know outside of Oregon, there are fees that have been put in place on second homes specifically to try to at least disincentivize or better balance the mix of housing.
Right.
One more question on that subject. We're talking about, I mean, it's easy to have a rule of no short-term rentals. I don't know if it's permissible, but it's easily comprehended and it's in place in places like Wilder. But the second home concept is different. And I wonder if it's even permissible to have a not an incentive base, but a prohibition. In other words, right into the code that, you know, must be owner occupied. Is that even possible? And does anybody do it if it is possible?
I'm not aware of owner occupancy requirements apart from things like if the city were to provide a certain incentive to a project, like a property tax exemption or a system development charge waiver, those could be tied to deed restrictions that would specify, anything that, I'm not a lawyer, but it could specify a range of things like the affordability requirements of the units, and an occupancy requirement. So it's a little bit more complicated. It's again about the policy piece and things like fees, and deed restrictions, but you could think of that as part of the entire picture of housing. But to even get to a point where somebody might be able to and interested in building that type of project, you need to change some of these other standards that apply universally to make that appealing in the first place. So it's very complicated and it's all interconnected, but you're raising some really good points. Does that help kind of provide some leads on how you might do some of these things?
Yes.
I just might add, ChatGPT has some ideas.
The only thing about ChatGPT, I know everyone knows this, but it's not necessarily understanding are these things legal in Oregon, that sort of thing. So we always like to disclaimer that.
Okay.
Disclaimer.
Yeah, I think we need to move forward. We do have limited time, so.
Okay, so we'll keep going. I'm going to turn it over to Victor to talk about code concepts, what they are, and how they're responsive to some of these barriers that we've identified.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. I think you did a good job setting us up here. So I'll be expanding on our topic of code concepts. So Rachel said earlier, code concepts are ideas that we could implement through the city zoning and land use code to help achieve city goals. So things related to housing attainability, production, livability. We're interested in exploring some of these ideas with you and kind of presenting on what we've heard so far from our advisory committee and some of the planning commissioners who are a part of those meetings. So you'll see in the bulleted list there some of the points that the code concepts help address and respond to. So these reflect some of the earlier goals that were mentioned. And I'll say there are, at this point in time, 7 code concepts that we've been brainstorming as a team. So they are to allow ADUs, accessory dwelling units, to allow middle housing types in residential zones as permitted uses, tweaks to development standards, so things like adjusting densities, lot sizes, setbacks, lot coverage, updating the retail commercial zone, the C1 zone, to allow for mixed use development, potentially looking at rezoning or strategically rezoning land in the R1 zone to a higher density zone where it makes sense. And lastly, beyond the piece of kind of implementing what is required for affordable housing and the density bonuses there, thinking through if there are other incentives that should be introduced within the city's code. So I'll walk through each of these one by one, and then what I'd like to get to is sharing feedback on what the advisory committee and some members of the planning commission have given us when we presented this to them. And then we'll kind of end on a discussion with your input. So I'll start with the ADUs. So this one is more straightforward and something we've heard good support for. The idea here is to allow for at least one ADU for each single unit dwelling, and that ADU could be interior to that primary residence. It could be, or it could be detached. We think this makes a lot of sense. It's an easy way to add additional housing supply to the city without necessarily like demolishing the existing structure. And yeah, like I said, it's something we've heard good support for. So we've included this concept. The next one is to allow middle housing types as outright permitted uses in residential zones. So middle housing types refer to housing types like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters. I'll note that in Yahat's code today, some of these middle housing types are permitted, but only in certain zones. In addition to that, definitions could be lacking. So, for example, cottage clusters are not defined in the city code, and they are also not permitted. And the kind of value proposition here is that middle housing types would allow for additional housing units of different types and therefore different levels of attainability, and could help kind of support the overall city goals around housing and livability. The next two have to do with development standards and some adjustments to those. So concept 3 is around density and minimum lot size standards. Adjusting density could mean increasing or adjusting the minimum density, and it could also mean setting a maximum density. And lot size adjustments could mean reducing minimum lot sizes in order to build kind of the desired housing. We think these standards would help allow for housing of different types, especially to the point that Rachel made earlier of land being constrained in Yachats and it being expensive. These tweaks to the development standards help unlock and maximize the amount of potential that we could have for housing of different types. So this one is density minimum lot standards. The next one is around
Victor, a question for you. So
Yeah.
can the density and minimum, the setbacks, for example, can those be tied to the type of housing? So that I can't just build a bigger house taking up more of the lot? They only apply to cases where you're building more than one unit on the property?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great thought. And our intention here is we would adjust these development standards as they relate to certain housing types. So this is something to explore, but we could have that level of specificity when it comes to certain middle housing types, or it could be a part of the zone districts themselves and something we would specify there. But that's a great point. These development standards are often tied to specific development types. That way they're kind of context sensitive and responsive.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, yeah, so the next code concept is also on the kind of tweaking of development standards piece. This one is around reducing setbacks and increasing lot coverage. So same rationale here. We want to make sure the standards related to setbacks and lot coverage allow for greater use of the land for different housing types, and thereby making housing more feasible and having it pencil out. And yeah, to your earlier point, this would also be tied to specific types of housing and zone districts.
Another question about that is, so our setback is often determined by the road right of way. I don't understand how you can change the setback on, for example, the front of the house if it's facing a street and we have a 20-foot road right of way. Am I just not educated enough on this topic? But clearly we want to preserve our road right of way.
Those are two separate issues. So the setback applies to the property itself, not to the right of way. So the setback is, the privately owned piece of property. And within that privately owned piece of property, there's what we call a building envelope, which includes the setbacks, the lot coverage. What you're talking about is the public right of way, which is not affected by these changes.
Thank you.
In some cases, people may not know what is that right of way versus what is their property, but that's a separate concern.
Yeah, you can kind of see from this choppy diagram we put together, but the black boundary you could pretend is like the property boundary, the tax lot. And then this dashed blue line represents the setback. So how much of the development is allowed, to what distance it's allowed to approach kind of the property boundary. So the tweaks here would be looking at decreasing some of those setback standards to allow for development to take up more space within that tax lot. Hopefully that answers your question there.
Yeah, I need to learn more.
All good. We're in it together. Okay, so concept 5, in the retail commercial zone, which is this purple zone that fronts the highway, residential uses are currently allowed outright, but mixed use development is a conditional use. So we had some conversations about this with the advisory committee and the project management team, and the recommendation here is to allow mixed use development outright instead of having it be a conditional use, especially given that housing by itself is already allowed or permitted today. So that's kind of a more straightforward change there. But doing this would allow for greater flexibility of both, residential and commercial types, and also mixed use development that could be part of the strategy to increase housing, option and diversity within the city. Okay. Oh, sorry.
On the C1, wouldn't we restrict the R1 within the C1? Are you not looking at that?
Restrict the R1 within the C1.
That is, I think I'm understanding the question, Victor. So that is something we are also looking at. And I think when you say R1, you mean low density residential development. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah, so that's another, right now, the allowance is you can do any type of residential development that's allowed in residential zones in that C1 zone. And so another piece of this strategy is taking a look at, should there be a minimum density if you're going to allow certain types of residential, and not just allow a standalone single unit house in that C1 zone. So good point. We're looking at both things.
Thanks for weighing in there, Rachel. Okay, and then the next concept has to do with rezoning, or strategically rezoning land in R1 to something higher density. So you'll see on the bar chart on the left there, a snapshot we took from the housing needs analysis. We know that most or a large portion of Yachats buildable land is within that R1 zone. And like Rachel said earlier in the presentation, there is, or Yachats needs more land to meet the needs of duplexes and some of those middle housing types that is not the single unit housing type. So this co-concept would look at, it would be a longer study, but it would look at rezoning portions of the R1 district to something higher density. So perhaps R2, R3, R4. And I'll say that this likely would be outside this project, but something that the city could consider conducting a follow-up kind of analysis to see if this makes sense to do.
Can I interrupt real quick, Victor, on that? So this
Yeah.
would be kind of referring to the comment you made earlier, Nicole, on being able to use some of our existing housing stock to create, that is in the R1 to create the, like a duplex or a triplex within a house, right? Okay. So Victor, we would need to do something outside of this project to complete that, what you're saying?
Yes and no. To the extent where we are looking at allowing more middle housing types in residential zones, that's something that we would cover, I think.
Okay. Okay.
So that's kind of like this concept
That would be
here.
within that concept. Okay.
Yeah, I just mean like specific to this concept, it's looking at rezoning R1 to another zone. So the distinction there is if we look at a map of just the R1 zone, are there portions that could be rezoned to something else? To the extent where we're looking at allowing middle housing types within residential zones, yes, that's something we will look at as a part of this project.
Thank you.
Of course.
Is it safe to say that based on your housing needs analysis, that Yachats cannot meet the projected need for multifamily without doing something about R1? Either to rezone it to multifamily or to do something to increase density through ADUs. But not doing anything at all, we simply don't have enough land for the projected need for multifamily.
Rachel.
That's true, and I think we're careful when we talk about enough land because there is enough land, and what's needed is what we think of as efficiency measures. So efficiency measures are things like allowing these additional housing types that Victor is talking about, requiring lower minimum lot sizes, so being able to use that existing land more efficiently. And that's where within Oregon, we go to those things first, those changes, rather than adding land to the supply, which is your urban growth boundary. So just to be technically accurate, that's, either being able to use the existing land more efficiently is where we start and where we intend to get to as part of this project. And we believe that that's achievable through some of these code concepts that we're recommending.
Okay, I'll round us out here with our last co-concepts, which is to provide incentives for affordable housing. Earlier, Rachel was covering that as part of the compliance piece of the project. We will amend the code to have things like density bonuses for affordable housing. This co-concept has to do more with exploring other types of incentives that the city could introduce to incentivize affordable housing. What these are, we're not entirely sure at this point, but it's something that we also would put in that basket of the city potentially being able to study some of these incentives outside of this project. But just noting that it has come up and it is something that the community is interested in. Okay, so here's another way to frame the code concepts that we've presented. So earlier we listed some of the barriers and issues that the city is facing, and we thought we would pair it with some of the code concepts we introduced just to make that connection stronger. So for example, if the issue is around use regulations that are too restrictive in residential zones, we think code concepts like allowing ADUs and allowing middle housing types as permitted uses in residential zones would be something that directly kind of responds to that barrier and issue. If the issue is the density is too low. You know, a lot of the tweaks that we mentioned regarding minimum densities and lot sizes, um, allowing middle housing, kind of rezoning R1 land or our land in R1 zone to something else. Those respond to that. If the issue is around the overall minimum lot area that is too high to allow for housing types, again, I think those have to do with the co-concepts that look at adjusting the density and lot sizes, especially for middle housing. Same with lot coverage and setbacks. So we had co-concept that looked at adjusting those specifically. And then if the issue is around use regulations that are too restrictive in commercial zones, that responds well with our co-concept to allow for uses or mixed use development within that commercial zone. And then finally, if the issues around looking at incentives for affordable housing, that's where this co-concept would come in, of a more detailed study of what might actually be effective to incentivize affordable housing. Okay, so this is where I'd like to land, and after kind of talking about this and sharing out what the advisory committee and members of planning commission have shared with us, I'll take a pause and we can kind of begin the discussion portion of the meeting. But I wanted to share out the feedback that we've received so far. So one of the exercises we did as a part of our meetings was to start plotting the co-concepts on this matrix. So you'll see at the bottom on the left, it's everything that participants thought should happen in the near term. And then on the right, everything longer term. And then at the bottom, co-concepts that are perhaps lower priority currently, and then things at the top being higher priority. And what we heard is there are co-concepts that have clear direction and are supported enough that we would recommend moving forward. So this includes the concepts related to allowing ADUs and updating the residential standards in that C1 zone. So these would be fairly straightforward, and we think this could take the form of proposed amendments when we write the discussion draft of the code amendments, which is our next task after the co-concepts phase. There's a cluster of co-concepts in the middle, kind of denoted by that circle there. And this has to do with the co-concepts related to middle housing. So allowing middle housing in residential zones, but also looking at the development standards that would pair well with them. So adjusting minimum density, lot sizes, reducing setbacks, increasing lot coverage. And I'll add that participants also brought up 2 other points here for our team to study. So subdivision and partition has to do with the idea of looking at potentially a pathway to subdividing lots that have middle housing so that the units are on their own respective lots. And with regards to parking, that was a big one we heard, of just making sure that the parking standards we introduce as a part of this cluster of changes related to middle housing makes sense and is neither too onerous, but also allows for the needed housing from the community. Finally, there are 2 co-concepts that I've alluded to earlier that we think are long-term and participants flagged as more appropriate for future phases of work conducted by the city. So this has to do with looking at more specific incentives for affordable housing, as well as a more in-depth understanding of where R1 pieces of land in the R1 zone could be rezoned to something higher density. I will very quickly just pivot us to the timeline so you have an understanding of where we are in our next task, and then I'll flip back to the discussion. So We're currently in July, so this is our kind of joint planning commission city council meeting here. Upcoming, we are going to pivot to the code amendments phase of the work, and we'll have 3 bites of the apple here. So we'll have a first draft, a second draft, and basically like the adoption ready draft. And in that time span, we will be meeting with the advisory committee 2 times, as well as the community. So we have, this is in the works, and we'd like to get some feedback today on this as well. But we have a community engagement phase of the project where we've penciled in for kind of like September timeframe, where participants could weigh in on the specificities on some of these code concepts and how they are to work within the code. Okay, so with all that being said, I will pivot us back to this slide, and I'll ask if there's any clarification we can provide before diving into the whole kind of like, do you agree with this feedback we've heard? Are there any kind of like priorities you see moving forward, that type of thing. But to start, yeah, any other questions related to these code concepts, anything we can help make clear?
So I'm gonna have a question, then we're gonna take a short break. So my question for this is update residential standards in the C1 zone. Is there a mechanism that can allow for grandfathering in single-family homes that are currently in C1? I envision, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point, a developer buying 2 or 3 homes in a row that are C1, single-family homes in C1, and then putting in much higher density housing when the surrounding neighbors bought their homes with the assumption that these were single-family homes.
I welcome Rachel's thoughts here, but my
I mean,
initial thought is
that has happened. I'm not just making that up. That happens in community.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, what I think you're asking is there a way to guarantee that those stay single family homes even though they're C1? Is that
Yeah,
what you're asking?
essentially, yes. Can they be grandfathered in?
So when we talk about grandfathering in, that's something that is a non-conforming use potentially. So right now, those single unit homes are allowed outright in that C1 zone under the existing regulations, which allow any residential use that's allowed in the residential zones. If those regulations are to change, like say you decide single family homes are no longer allowed in the C1 zone, then they become a non-conforming use. And if in the future someone wants to redevelop, they can't any longer build a single family home in that C1 zone. So that's a pretty technical explanation. We're not saying that you have to get rid of the allowance that exists right now, but there's no way, because this is a C1 zone, this is not an R1 zone, to say you can only build single family homes unless it were to be rezoned to another zone.
So that may be, that's an option. Take the C1s that currently have single-family homes and rezone them to R1.
That's an option, and yeah, typically when zone, not universally, but typically when zoning exists, the intent is that over time the uses align with higher intensity commercial uses. That's why the C1 zone is designated where it is, and those older uses are sort of phased out over time. So yeah, it's a tricky thing if you buy your property adjacent to a commercial zone. Not everybody is always attuned to that, but yes, there are certainly cases where changes are made on either end of the spectrum over time.
And to make it extra clear, the concept that we're proposing as a part of this project isn't to not allow for those single unit dwelling units, but rather it's to allow for mixed use development as a permanent use instead of a conditional use within the C1 zone. So another way of saying single unit dwellings will still be permitted within the C1 zone, and that's not something we're looking to change as a part of this project.
Well,
Okay,
Victor, just
thank
to
you.
clarify, it could change. I don't think that's something we have closed the door on, because another piece of feedback we've heard is maybe that C1 zone doesn't make sense to see it's a commercial zone. That makes sense to see commercial and higher intensity, mixed use and residential development. And it shouldn't be somewhere where you're only allowed to develop or allowed to develop a detached single unit house. So not to create a controversy, but I just want to be clear about you could explore limiting or not allowing single unit housing as in that C1 zone as part of this work or not. That might be something that we tease out as part of the community engagement. Like, what's the appetite for making that change? But as Victor mentioned, the proposal in terms of what we're seeing on this chart is simply to allow mixed use development outright, as like that's the first piece of that code concept. And we may not do anything else in that C1 zone. We don't know yet.
Okay, thank you. It's something we have to wrestle with. When the city was zoned, it was a very different era, and it has evolved, so. Okay. All right, if you can indulge us, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So I will adjourn the work session for 5 minutes, and we'll come back at 20 minutes after.
Sounds good.
Okay?
Wonderful.
back into the work session back into session. Councilor Shaughnessy had to step out, so she will be gone. We have a limited amount of time and a lot of business today, so I appreciate the Cascadia Partners' time. Can we move directly into the discussion at this point and questions from the Planning Commission and any additional questions? We're not shy. We've obviously been asking questions, but if there are additional questions, can we move into that phase of the presentation?
Yes, definitely. I hope you're still seeing my screen
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
shared there. Okay, so yes, I think we're at a good point now to ask from the feedback that we've received from the advisory committee and project management team. We're looking to see if this jives with your priorities for the code concept. So we've kind of laid out here the proposal where we have, you know, these two concepts around allowing ADUs and updating standards in the C1 zone that we think are more clear and we should go forward and kind of develop them. This tranche in the middle, these co-concepts that relate to allowing middle housing, adjusting standards that relate to them as something that we'll progress and look at as well. And then finally, the incentives for affordable housing, potentially rezoning land in R1 zone as future phases of work outside of this project. Does this track with your preference as well? Like, does this priority make sense to you?
Planning Commission? Okay.
Well, we actually.
You did it.
Yeah, I'm part of
Yeah.
it. So I actually had input into this.
Yeah.
So yes, yeah.
Hey, you wouldn't be the first one that reneges on what you did. Any city councils, any thoughts?
I was on the advisory committee as well,
Okay.
and I agree with it.
My thought
Right.
is, you know, the ADU seems reasonable, standards to C1. And I think the middle housing, in a more middle term is appropriate. We do have mechanisms. I mean, we're talking about doing some middle housing, already. We can use, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have planned unit development capabilities for specific projects that we could use to encourage or to allow more middle housing. Is that correct? I mean, does the planned unit development allow us to do that? Or our potential water project, I should say?
It does. One specific item that isn't included is the cottage cluster
Okay.
concept. I think that may have a lot of potential when that feeds into the project that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that it actually does have, maybe that's something that could be towards the front of the middle housing as cottage clusters. We have several spots where I think it would be helpful, and how much coverage and what do we, you know, seems simple, but you know, is it 2 units? Is it 4 units? Is it 12 teeny units? I think we need some guardrails, guidance around that, but I think that'd be higher priority than some of the other items. Just
Okay,
speaking.
that's helpful feedback, and that's something we would explore as the city's current code doesn't have a definition for a cottage cluster, and
Yeah.
as you know, in its entirety, but especially to the point you're making of how many units does that mean? That's something we can definitely explore as a part of this concept. I see Catherine with a hand up, so I just want to make sure we get to them.
I just wanted to comment on the plan unit development. We've been able to use that successfully in some cases, but it requires a minimum of 2 contiguous acres. So it's not really an option for smaller projects, higher density. You know, for some of Lane Morrill's projects, it's been ideal, and it does give the Planning Commission quite a bit of discretion on some things that they don't have under other parts of the code, but the 2 acre minimum is kind of restrictive.
Okay, thank you, Catherine.
Also, and then I'll go away. One of the reasons that we put the rezoning land in the R1 zone kind of long-term is that I think what we've seen historically is that just upzoning, like changing R1 to a higher density residential without either some incentive or some minimum mandatory density, we don't see that property being used in the way it was intended. I think one of the most striking statistics that came out of the buildable land inventory for me was that we had not had a single multifamily project in the R4 zone in a 20-year period. So we can make more R4 land, but if people don't choose to use it that way, right now, all we're giving them now is a larger lot coverage for single family residents. So we sort of need to do that in conjunction with some other thinking about how we incentivize using high density for high density.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so thank you for your feedback on this. And then I guess our next question would be, as we prepare for the community engagement phase of this project, and as you've had a kind of a preview of the code concepts that we're grappling with, do you have any kind of like questions or concerns that you're anticipating from the broader community as we go to them to solicit input on some of these concepts? Are there things that we should more cater towards, like questions that we should definitely ask? Are there things that we should shy away from and not ask? That's kind of the sense that we're trying to tease out here.
Well, I have a question about the presentation that'll be given to the community. I think that if when the presentation's given, if it could give like good examples of how people can use the ADUs in the middle income housing. I'm not sure exactly how we propose to do the community impact, but like the benefits of ADUs or benefits of the middle housing types, cottage clusters, those examples, like just kind of curious where you plan to go with the and present the community development input part.
Yeah, this part is it's something we'll workshop with our project management team and advisory committee. But insofar as our discussions have gone, we were thinking of a two-parter strategy here. So we would have some in-person component, something like an open house or a workshop where people could come learn about the project. There could be a presentation, like you suggested, that is more public facing, something that really helps kind of show what these concepts are in clear terms before soliciting input. So that's kind of the in-person piece. And then we were thinking of potentially also exploring an online survey of sorts. So a questionnaire that could be sent out, something more broad-based to solicit input from community members that couldn't make it in person, but just to get their feedback also around the same set of materials. So to your point of, including clear examples and images of some of these concepts, yes, that's something we will make sure to do.
I think that I would think for the community, it would be really important for you to address Mayor Birdie's issue about, or concern that he expressed about how do we do these things and not just become a much, much larger second home community. That would be a big concern of mine, and I think it would be a big concern to many people.
Agreed.
Noted. Okay, that's something we can definitely think about and discuss with our project management team. Rachel, did you have any initial or like immediate thoughts responding to that?
I think it's we know that that's an ongoing concern in Yachats, that's been captured throughout the different projects that we've done. And part of this work, as I mentioned before, is meant to think about how can modifications to the development standards be responsive to that concern, which is just one piece of the equation. And so I think part of what we'll need to do is message that, right? Just because you change the development standards without other policy related changes and intentions, that's not going to solve or address this concern entirely. So I think, just to be clear, part of our responsibility in the engagement is to message, like, not only we've heard this as a concern from the community, here is part of how you might implement a solution to address that concern, but it's not going to fix everything. Is that helpful? It's kind of part of what we might do is create an open-ended question as either part of a workshop or a survey or both to say, what are some ideas that you have for addressing this balance between second homes and full-time residents. We know of some tools, we explored some tools as part of the housing implementation plan. And I think, to tie it back to what we're looking at here in terms of high, level of priority and then near term versus long term, I would put this concern as a high priority and a long term process. This will be, again, one piece of that equation, but it's a long term issue that you're contending with, and it's highly complex. It has to do with the real estate market. And there's only so much that you can do as a city in terms of your regulations to intervene with the real estate market. But another piece of the equation will have to do with some policies that you might explore in other work as well.
One thing I'd suggest that you might want to take a look at is the Coney low-income housing study. I don't remember the official name, but they actually did address that. And they had some very sophisticated graphs showing essentially the number of units versus time that it took to overcome the second home conundrum, because they recognized that immediately as you build low-income housing or any other housing. And I think their analysis was sophisticated, and it would be very helpful. Just in terms of the presentation, the housing implementation plan was done in 2023. We forget quickly. It was not, and I will say, just as a political perspective, it was not universally loved. There is a lot of people in town that don't want any kind of density increase. And so I would suggest, refreshing the public and the citizens' memory as to why we're even talking about this, what kind of housing we're talking about, that they're not going to be, low row houses after row houses after row houses in the city. Just, you need to be sensitive to the fact that it's been several years and it was not universally loved to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Part of what we intend to prepare for the community engagement work includes a vision, it's an informational component, but it's also going to be a visual component where we're representing some of these things with imagery, with diagrams, and with messaging that communicates the things that you're mentioning, and the reality is that not everybody is going to love every aspect of this work. But our idea is to take a temperature check of what the community values are and what the priorities are, and arrive at a set of changes that are supported. Because that's what a code amendment is. It needs to go through Planning Commission and be approved, and it needs to go through council and be approved. And that's why we're talking to you about these things, so that your feedback and the community feedback is informing what we arrive at in terms of the amendments. And those are things that you approve of in the end, based on all of this work and these conversations that have happened.
Other questions?
I want to direct this to the council.
would it be helpful if in these discussions about changing, increasing density and so forth, to frame the discussion in terms of workforce housing or middle housing versus of quote unquote affordable housing or low income housing? The impression I get is that when you talk about making housing more affordable, the first thing people think of is low income housing. But I think when you start talking about workforce housing, everybody goes, oh yeah, we need that.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's two different things.
Yeah, they are two different things. I think we make that distinction and frame the argument more in terms of the middle housing, workforce housing.
Yeah.
That might make it a little more.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's really helpful to hear.
Yeah.
And that's something we can workshop, that kind of exact messaging around trying to support city goals for greater housing options, attainability, that type of stuff.
The other attribute of that is not, workforce sort of implies to some extent more working families, with the emphasis on families being able to afford to live in Yahas. A pretty geriatric population as it is, and we have more families than most people think, but we're certainly not tapped out in terms of family housing. Okay, I'm sorry to have to cut this off.
I do have one last question.
I'm sorry.
So I just wanted to clarify the deliverable that'll be done on the project timeline. So it looks like towards the end of the year, we will have rewritten codes that then we can approve and then move forward with, or is it more strong recommendations that we would then put together in a new code?
Yes. So we, like I mentioned earlier, we'll have kind of 3 versions of the code amendments. So after this phase of the work, which is the code concepts phase, our immediate next task is to start on our first version of those code amendments. So both the code amendments that address what is mandatory and required, the pieces that Rachel covered, but also some of these code concepts that we've been talking about. So that work will take us from August till kind of like early December. And at that point, we'll transition to our adoption ready kind of amendments. That's kind of this last bar you see at the bottom, covering December through April. So the end deliverable of this project will be a set of updated kind of amendments for your code that would be ready to be adopted. And it's something we are also scoped to help support that adoption process.
Thank you.
That's right. And I was forgot this, but when you do the code amendments as required, could you include footnotes or something that reference which specific code amendments, which specific state code this amendment is going to address? That would be helpful. I know you're correct. Not everybody's going to care, but some of us might want to cross-reference.
Okay, yeah, we can put in a note to add that as part of the commentary for those proposed amendments. Okay, well, to be respectful of time, I think we'll try and wrap up here. But were there any last thoughts or questions that anyone wanted to share?
Well, I think that we appreciate the work and looking forward to moving forward on this.
Okay.
Okay. With that, we have to eat in 20 minutes and even less before people start coming in. So thank you very much, Cascadia Partners, all 3 of you, Rachel, Victor, and Ray, who didn't get a chance to speak much. But thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. And I will adjourn the work session of July 16th.
Thank you so